Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Raquel Faria. I'm a doctor in internal medicine at the Centro Hospitalar Universitário Santo António in Porto, Portugal. Today, I'm joined by Professor Zahir Amoura and Richard Furie from the Lupus Academy Steering Committee, who will be providing expert insights from the key lupus research presented at the major congress in 2023, including the 5th International Congress of SLE, Lupus 2023, the annual meetings of the EULA and the ACR meetings. During this episode, we will look at the new guidelines recommendations from the management of SLE and lupus nephritis, review the latest clinical trials data on new and emerging SLE therapies, and touch some future trends in SLE research and the SLE therapy pipeline. If you published interesting data on SLE in 2023 and we didn't mention it, we're sorry. Don't take it personally. Zahir, Richard, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. The new EULA recommendations were presented in EULA in June for the management of SLE. It was much anticipated update. It was released in June and included ambitious SLE treatment goals, some that were already discussed in several other meetings, but now they were on the guidelines. New insights on the adverse effects of chronic glucocorticoids, also that were already known, but now with a more strict recommendation, as well as novel treatments and management approaches. Zahir, what do you think that these updated guidelines and recommendations will change on the management of patients with SLE throughout the world?
Well, I think these recommendations are very useful in clinical practice because they allow us to know how we manage SLE in 2024. So they also give the therapeutic strategy for SLE in future years, particularly with the use of biologics. These are recommendations developed by a panel of experts. And what is very important is that these recommendations now underline the importance of individualized care. They emphasize the importance of reducing corticosteroid therapy with a target dose of prednisone of 5 milligrams per day or less. So they are very useful and they give us a way to manage SLE on the short and on the long term. And I think they will change the way we manage lupus in the future. However, there are points that deserve to be discussed. For example, the recommended target dose of hydroxychloroquine is 5 milligrams per kilogram per day, which corresponds to 300 milligrams for a patient weighing 60 kilograms. And in my opinion, this dose is too low to control SLE flares. The dose of 5 milligrams per day is the one which limits the risk of toxicity of hydroxychloroquine, but the effective dose is rather around 6.5 milligrams per kilogram per day. So we give instead 400 milligrams per day in this case, and we do a visual field and an OCT to screen for toxicity. Nevertheless, these recommendations are very useful.
What is your point of view about this, Richard? Do you think it will change the clinical practice?
Well, will I change my management of lupus patients? No, that sounds like heresy. But I don't think that should be misinterpreted. So the guidelines are very important, especially for those who don't see a lot of lupus patients. Yes. But for those of us who have been treating lupus patients for decades and writing the guidelines, we've been living by these principles of reducing disease activity, preventing flares, limiting steroid use, and moving to alternative drugs such as biologics, all with the goal of preventing or restricting damage and improving the lives of our patients. So personally, I'll be doing the same thing. But I think for the community in general, the guidelines are very good. And I must say, it was the first time I participated in guideline development. And the team that led the effort did a phenomenal job. I think they read every paper that was ever published on lupus.
So the other question that it's kind of a under question of the first one is what you just highlighted, is that for the experts, their clinical practice was not so different from what the current guidelines are recommending. And so these guidelines are not for the experts in the centers that are tertiary centers, university centers. They are more likely to change all the other settings. Besides hydroxychloroquine, what do you think are the details on the guidelines that is more different from what you are currently practicing on your center, Richard?
I'm not sure the guidelines are any different than what I do in practice. I mean, we'll talk about some of the lupus nephritis guidelines a little bit later. But yeah, I try to get the prednisone dose as low as possible, even down to 0. Hydroxychloroquine, I actually send off blood levels. We're blessed with the ability to get those levels here in the United States. So I kind of already do, what's in the guidelines. But I think, again, as you mentioned, for people who are not so familiar with lupus, then I think the guidelines are very important. And they do stress minimizing steroid use, moving to biologics a little sooner than later, using immunosuppressives and so forth. So I think it was very well done.
I have a question, Raquel.
Yes.
It's about the daily dose of hydroxychloroquine, because as I said before, the target dose is 5 milligrams per kilogram per day, and it's 300 milligrams for a woman weighing 60 kilograms. And for me, it's too low. Again.
So, and that question is for Richard, is it?
Yes, for each one, for you.
I dose by exposure, and I'll make an argument that all of the medicines that we give should be dosed by exposure, as long as you have an idea of what the target is. So for whole blood, at least the company where we send our samples to suggests, and I think this largely came from your country, from Natalie et al., and they suggest getting to a target of around 1,000 nanograms per ml. So by sending off levels, I can tell who's taking their medicine and who's not taking their medicine, and who needs to have an increase or a reduction in their dose. But I must say, I get letters from the ophthalmologist all the time that I'm overdosing my patients. And then I send them the results of the drug levels.
Can we think of this recommendation as, for the lupus patients, during a long time period that we are going to follow them, we're not going to do the same dose of hydroxychloroquine every single day for 10 years or 15 years, or are we? So can we think of this recommended dose as, in the beginning, we can go a little bit higher, and then when the patient is okay, we taper that for a lesser dose in your clinical practice, or do you do the 5 milligrams when the patient is not active? The question is really, do you have a different dosage for hydroxychloroquine when the patient is active versus when the patient is on clinical remission for a long time?
That's a very, very good question. And I think we don't have enough data to completely conclude today. But what I can say is that there is a very interesting study published by the SLEEK, showing that in SLE patients in remission, when the dose of hydroxychloroquine was tapered, the risk of flaring was higher. And there is also, I think, a paper in JAMA published by the group of Jill Bayan showing quite the same. And there is also a study, a very nice prospective study done by Japanese physicians showing in cutaneous lupus that when you decrease the dose under 5 milligrams, there is a risk of flaring. So in my opinion and in my clinical practice, even when the patient is in remission, we don't try to taper the dose of hydroxychloroquine. What we do, in fact, is to screen patients for visual fields and OCT to prevent the risk of retinal toxicity, but we don't try to decrease the dose. But this is our clinical practice. So,
do you decrease the dose, Richard?
Well, again, I follow levels, and I am somewhat complacent with a relatively low level. Not real low. I mean, there's low and there's low. But if someone has a level of, say, 600 or 800 nanograms per ml, even though the target's 1,000, but they're doing well and they have been doing well, I will just keep them around that level. A different story if someone's down around 200 or 100, then they're clearly not taking their pills. So that's a different story.
Okay, let's move on for the European Renal Association perspectives on the 2023 EOLAR guidelines update. So, focusing on the renal outcomes, the new guidelines highlight the importance of treating active lupus nephritis and the use of newly authorized treatments such as belimumab, heading on, or voclosporin as head-on therapy for class 3 and 4. Do you want to comment, Richard, on the key insights of the European Renal Association perspective on these?
Well, I actually just read that article last night in preparation for this podcast. It was interesting. So you're referring to the European Renal Association Immunonephrology Working Group.
Yes.
And they published their article/editorial in Nephrology, Dialysis, Transplantation. It's not a journal I typically read, but they published it in October of last year. So they did, in fact, provide an editorial that focused on the trial data that served as the foundation for the new EULAR guidance, focusing on lupus nephritis. So they reviewed the BLISS-LN and the Aurora 1 trials. So those are the trials of belimumab and voclosporin, respectively. And if I can take some time, I'll review many of the points that they made. So I'll look at my list so I don't forget anything. But to start off, they agreed that both belimumab and voclosporin are, in fact, useful additions to the armamentarium to optimize lupus nephritis management. But they pointed out some differences between the drugs that might guide clinicians in their choice between the two drugs. So there are about 10 points that I'd like to make based upon their article. So we'll start out with the entry eGFR between the two trials. So patients with eGFRs less than 45 mLs per minute were excluded from the voclosporin trial, whereas for BLISS-LN, the cutoff was around 30 mLs per minute. So if you encounter a patient with a GFR less than 45, you might be swayed to add belimumab if you're going to add a second drug to, say, mycophenolate, or for that matter, cyclophosphamide. Second one, there were subgroup analyses, and I never really know how to handle subgroup analyses because the studies are not powered to take into account the smaller subgroups. But anyway, the subgroup analyses for the belimumab trial demonstrated that patients with baseline levels of proteinuria greater than 3 grams did not fare as well as those with levels that were less than 3 grams. So therefore, you might think that patients with greater than 3 grams of proteinuria might in fact do better with voclosporin.
Mm-hmm.
All right, another point. Belimumab can be administered sub-Q or intravenously, whereas voclosporin is oral. And so in the non-adherent patient, and I don't know what happens in Europe, but boy, here in the United States, we have a lot of non-compliant and non-adherent patients. But anyway, in the non-adherent patient, parenteral administration of belimumab might assure greater adherence, but I emphasize might. If they're coming in for IV, then you can track them. But with voclosporin, the pill burden is pretty huge. I mean, they are taking somewhere between 4 and 6 pills per day, and add that to, their 4 to 6 mycophenylates and their calcium, their vitamin D, their ACE inhibitor, maybe some are on an SGL2 inhibitor. Anyway, it's a lot of pills to take in one day. All right, in the BLISS-LN trial of belimumab, background therapy could include either mycophenolate or cyclophosphamide, whereas in the Aurora trial, only mycophenolate was used as background. So therefore, if one is compelled to use cyclophosphamide, belimumab, we know from the BLISS-LN data, could be safely added. Both studies required steroid tapering, but it was a little bit more aggressive in the voclosporin trial, so just slightly different designs. They also went on to discuss tacrolimus data, even though that was obviously not studied in either of these two trials. But they looked at the past studies, mostly done in China, wondering if tacrolimus could be substituted for voclosporin. But they just felt that there was insufficient data outside of China to support the use of tacrolimus for lupus nephritis, though many of us certainly will use it,
Yes.
For example, in pregnancy. Last few points, the EULAR update recommends that treatment for lupus nephritis should be continued for at least 3 years. Now, patients in the BLISS-LN trial were followed for an additional 6 months after the endpoint at 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
The Aurora trial had a placebo-controlled extension. So there are only 2 studies that I can think of that had extensions that were placebo-controlled, and we'll talk about the other one in a little bit. And so the placebo-controlled extension for voclosporin added an additional 2 years of study beyond the original 1 year. And these data demonstrated durability of the proteinuric response, as well as a relatively flat eGFR slope. And we were concerned what might happen with the GFR over time, because there's a camp that feels that calcineurin inhibitors might in fact be nephrotoxic. But we did not see significant change in the GFR slope over time in those on voclosporin. So it may not be definitive proof of the lack of nephrotoxicity of voclosporin. We are awaiting some, or I guess it has come out in part about this follow-up kidney biopsies. But, it's suggestive that flat eGFR curve suggests that there's no significant nephrotoxicity to voclosporin. The EULAR recommendations also noted the potential value of repeated kidney biopsies to guide reduction and withdrawal of immunosuppressives when patients are in remission for at least 2 years. There's no question we don't do enough second, third, and fourth biopsies. I am certainly guilty of that. And I think we certainly need to do more. I think the impetus to do more of these second biopsies now is that we do have other drugs available. And the last point that I'll make is there certainly was mention made of the future, the use, for example, of SGLT2 inhibitors, though that remains an unknown, and they discuss some of the biologics in development. And, it's hard to get through one of these talks without mentioning cell therapy. So expansion of the cell therapy data will no doubt inform the value of this particular approach. And we could talk a little bit about that at the end. So that's my take on that article. It was very good. You just have to go find the journal and then read the article.
Zahir, do you have any additional comment?
No, I agree with Richard that the array perspective on the EULAR recommendations on lupus nephritis is very interesting because it gives you clues to choose which new treatments belimumab or voclosporin you should add to the standard of care? I think that in this context, the most important question, I'm sorry because I still have a question, is whether you associate belimumab or voclosporin with standard of care from the start of treatment or not. I think this is the main issue. It's very interesting to have two new drugs, and we have now clues to choose between these two drugs. The main question for me is, do you start with MMF plus low dose of steroid plus hydroxychloroquine plus belimumab or voclosporin? The prognosis of class 3 or 4 lupus nephritis is still very poor. 10 to 20% of patients still progress towards end-stage renal failure. So I should say that I prefer to combine belimumab or voclosporin from the start. In fact, in France, only belimumab, because voclosporin has not been approved. I think this is the main question for us.
And it's a very good question. And I don't really know in the United States what the breakdown is. Essentially, there are three camps. You have rheumatologists and nephrologists who say, well, I'll just go with mycophenolate alone, see how the patient does. If they don't do well, then I'll add a second drug. Then you have a camp that says, from the get-go, I'm going to give two drugs, mycophenolate and belimumab or voclosporin. And I don't know what the distribution is of those thoughts. And then you have a camp that says, no, I'm just going to go with mycophenolate alone. Patients, 40% of patients might do fine on that. But my belief and what I do is I give two drugs. And when I say two drugs, I'm really talking about mycophenolate and belimumab or mycophenolate and voclosporin on top of steroids and hydroxychloroquine. I give them up front because I think if you're going to do it. And that's how the studies were designed.
Yes.
Yes, I completely agree with you, Rich. But I think that some of our colleagues, especially nephrologists, are quite reluctant to start with the two drugs. They often prefer to treat with MMF or IV cyclophosphamide, to wait until 6 months or 1 year, and then to add or not belimumab or voclosporin. And I don't understand why, because the long-term prognosis of lupus nephritis is still very poor.
Yes. Yeah. So, and I think it's the time and the issue of if the lupus nephritis is very poor in prognosis, but also some other lupus patients do need and unmet needs of maintaining all the patients in remission. So we should go to new and emerging therapies for SLE. What were the data from 2023? There were several clinical trials that of approved drugs or late-stage investigational agents in SLE that were presented in 2023. For instance, the long-term data for the phase 3 TULIP study of anifrolumab in patients with SLE highlighted the favorable benefit-risk profile of anifrolumab for patients receiving standard therapy for moderate to severe SLE, and with the additional follow-up analysis that were presented in 2023 confirming the benefits of anifrolumab in this population. So, Richard, what is your opinion, not only for this particular study, but all the data about anifrolumab that was presented in 2023?
Yeah, there's a lot of data that has come out from the anifrolumab studies. So just for a refresher, anifrolumab is an antibody to the type 1 interferon receptor, so it blocks the type 1 interferon pathway. So you're really referring to the long-term extension of the TULIP studies. And I just mentioned a few minutes ago, there are only two studies that I can think of that had placebo-controlled extensions. Most of our extensions are open label. So one was the Aurora trial, voclosporin and lupus nephritis, but the other is the anifrolumab program, had a placebo-controlled long-term extension. So the fact that it was placebo control afforded the ability to compare those on 300 milligrams of anifrolumab to placebo. Now, the ratio of, we could go through all the details of the trial design, but I'll try to avoid that. But the ratio of those on anifrolumab 300 milligrams to placebo was somewhere around 4.5 to 1. So clearly those on anifrolumab outnumber those on placebo. So when you look at the article or look at the data, you have to account for that. So you'll look at normalized data. But anyway, the primary outcome of this long-term extension was safety, although efficacy was explored. And briefly, there really were no new safety signals. In fact, one thing that we worry about is shingles.
Yes.
And the rate of shingles in the phase 2 and phase 3, the first year of the phase 3, was about maybe a ratio of 4.5 to 1 in the treatment arm to the placebo arm. But that actually dropped. The frequency dropped during the extension, which is kind of interesting. My take on that was maybe if you develop shingles, you were afforded some protection thereafter. And during the extension, the rules on background therapies, steroids, immunosuppressives, were relaxed. So there was a general tapering of steroids. And I can't speak to what happened with immunosuppressives, but you were certainly allowed in the years of the extension study to lower the dose or perhaps even stop it. Anyway, so we also learned that once COVID vaccinations became available, there were no cases of COVID, although numbers were pretty small at that point in the trial. Now, on the efficacy side, and I must say that was exploratory, there was continued improvement in disease activity. We looked at steroid use, which was less in those who continued on anifrolumab compared to those who continued on placebo. And then at the recent ACR meeting, there were several posters that addressed improvement in various sleep ache domains. We included the renal domains. And then there were data also presented about the attainment of LL-DAS as well as DORIS. So very interesting to have a placebo group in the extension. One could discuss or argue about the ethics of maintaining people on placebo for such a long period of time. But again, the patient's safety comes first, and if patients were not doing well, they could drop out, which was another somewhat of a confounder in the study because there's a lot of selection bias in any of these extensions where over time patients who are not doing well will drop out of the study.
Zahir, do you have any comment on the anifrolumab data?
Well, now anifrolumab is available in France since September, and we use it frequently now. And what we can say is that we are very interested by the efficacy, the effectiveness of the drug, and I have nothing to add to what Richard said. Maybe just add that we always vaccinate our patients against flu, not only COVID and shingles, but also flu. But I agree with Richard's comments.
Do you, Richard, do you vaccinate against shingles?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I mandate that the patients get Shingrix prior to getting their first dose of anifrolumab. Okay. Easier said than done here because our health system, our hospital, makes the patients pay for that vaccine. And they don't want to pay $250 for each of the 2 shots. So I send them to the chain pharmacies, like CVS and Rite Aid. And I don't know, they're much more lenient about the insurance issues. So usually they get their shots there. But yeah, I think that's very important. Shingles obviously is nasty. And going back to the phase 2 study with anifrolumab, that's when we first saw that signal In the placebo group back in phase 2, there was a 2% frequency of shingles during the year. In the 300 milligram group, it was 5%. And then that grew to 9% in the 1,000 milligram group, though we're not using the 1,000 milligram in treatment. And just an interesting aside, as far as influenza, certainly they should get that vaccine. The original discoveries of interferon, and it wasn't called interferon when they first discovered it back in 1957, they called it viral interference. That was based on research done with a model of influenza virus in chicken eggs and chicken embryos.
Zahir, do you have reimbursement for the shingles vaccine in France?
No, not yet. Maybe we hope that we will get it during this year. And it's 250 euros, so it's quite expensive. So what we do in clinical practice is that we give oral antiviral, anti-herpes zoster to patients, but we don't know whether it's effective or not. So we're waiting for the inactive vaccine.
We don't have the reimbursement for also in Portugal, so, and it costs the 2 doses 380 euros. So some of the patients they can't do it. So that's one of the points. But we hope we'll be able to reimburse it for this kind of patients. There were another drug, the BLyS-APRIL inhibitor telitacicept, that has gained much interest during 2023 after the results and the approval in China. The results of the phase 3 trial presented at EULAR showed that it provides important and durable responses in patients with active SLE, demonstrating also a good safety profile over a 62-week period. Zahir, can you share your views with these results of this telitacicept and this trial?
As a refresher, telitacicept is a fusion protein which binds to and neutralizes the activity of B lymphocyte stimulator BLyS and proliferation-inducing ligand APRIL, thereby suppressing the development and survival of plasma cells and mature B cells. And telitacicept is being developed by a Chinese big pharma. This is the first time for me that I heard this kind of drug. And the phase 3 study, randomized placebo-controlled 52-week trial of telitacicept has been presented during the last EULAR meeting. And as you said, the study met its primary endpoint. And the endpoint was the proportion of patients achieving SRE4 at week 52. And there was a greater proportion of SLE patients in the telitacicept compared to placebo. The SRI4 response was sustained for up to week 52 in the telitacicept group. And the time to first SLE flare was significantly longer in the telitacicept group compared to placebo. So most of treatment side effects were of mild to moderate severity, and infections were comparable between the two arms. And there were no deaths reported in either group. So both the efficacy and the safety are interesting and confirm that the BLyS-APRIL inhibition is a pathway with a promising future in the treatment of SLE. And I think something which is very important is that the telitacicept is given subcutaneously, which is quite important because it is not needed to hospitalize or to refer your patient to the hospital. And the indication for this drug is active lupus with skin and or joint involvement. So I think that the subcutaneous injection is very relevant.
We probably need some confirmation of this data in a non-Asian population, probably, but it looks promising. Richard, do you have anything to add on telitacicept?
No, I think you just said it, a very important point. So the data are incredibly robust. And one has to wonder, why are the telitacicept data so robust, yet atacicept, which was studied many years ago, did not produce these kinds of results. Yet they're very similar molecules. So let's see how the studies go ex-China.
Yes. Also, the PASLey trial, that is the first of the TYK2 inhibitors, deucravacitinib, which is being used for other rheumatological diseases, demonstrated in SLE greater SRI response compared with placebo. And the recent analysis also revealed greater improvement in patients' reported outcomes, including pain, fatigue, overall health quality of life, with deucravacitinib compared with placebo. Richard, how do you think is important this response on the patient's reported outcomes, and can you compare with other similar trials on the last few years? Do you think this is a drug that really changes the patient's reported outcomes in a way that is different from other drugs?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a really rough time in our clinical trials demonstrating benefits in the patient-reported outcomes. But the abstract you're talking about was presented, I believe, by Marta Mosca and colleagues. And so those who received deucravacitinib, as you said, had improvements compared to patients on placebo in pain, in fatigue, in the SF-36 mental, and as well in the physical component scores at 1 year. So it's gratifying to finally see results, because we often lose sight over how the patient feels. So it's nice to see positive data like this. Why do PROs fail in most of our trials? I really don't have a good answer for that. Let's hope that changes. I don't know if there's anything particularly special about this drug, though certainly the conventional data were quite robust with this particular drug. So phase 3 is underway.
Let's see how it goes. And there was a trial also presented first time on EULAR, the phase 2 SLICK trial, that had 3 arms, I believe. The placebo versus a monotherapy with upadacitinib, 30 milligrams a day, double the dose that we are using on rheumatoid. And another arm that had a combination therapy of upadacitinib and elsubrutinib. I'm sorry, but this is really difficult to pronounce. So, and it showed that the upadacitinib monotherapy group also had significant improvements in SLE disease activity and reduced flare with an acceptable profile over the 48 weeks period. Zahir, what do you think about these results? And I will have to ask, what do you think about these results compared with the negative results of baricitinib in SLE?
Well, I think it's quite difficult to give you an answer, because as you mentioned before, the methodology of the trial is quite difficult, because the combination arm was stopped due to lack of efficacy, and the elsubrutinib, which is a selective Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitor, was continued, and the upadacitinib, which is a JAK inhibitor, was also continued. So, and what we have shown are the results of the continuation study at 48 weeks. So it's quite difficult to conclude, but it's interesting because it means that in a way JAK inhibitors can be used or Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitors, sorry, can be used for the treatment of SLE, but again, we need the confirmation in other studies. So.
Do you have any additional thoughts on this, Richard?
I think inhibition of the JAK-STAT pathway is promising. You asked why baricitinib failed, and these data look good. Well, baricitinib phase 2 was a success in SLE, though just kind of barely. And then phase 3 had mixed results. I always wondered with the baricitinib trial whether the dose was adequate. Maybe more needed to be given. But you have, the TYK2 data that we just talked about in Paisley, so very promising, and upadacitinib. And then there's, I don't know how much off-label use of Xeljanz here in the United States, but you hear anecdotes about people using it in lupus and benefiting. So, I think it's certainly a good target.
But probably the issue could be what is the right dose for SLE compared with the other diseases that we are using in rheumatology. The
problem with lupus trials from the very get-go, going back to 1994, 95 when we started, if a trial fails, you really don't know if it's the drug, the design of the trial, the designers, or the investigators. So, all or any permutation could be blamed.
Yeah, you're right. More and more trials are successful now using the SRI4.
Well, that's a whole nother debate. I hate when people ask me, well, which is better, SRI4 or BICLA? Because we've seen mixed results.
Also in New Light, I presented a study, a phase 3 study comparing baricitinib in lupus nephritis, and it revealed significant improvement in disease activity and proteinuria response versus cyclophosphamide, and a good tolerability profile. Richard, can you comment? What do you think about the results and the trial that was presented?
Yeah, so as I just mentioned, the phase 3 baricitinib and SLE, those studies were called the BRAVE studies, had mixed results. But because they were mixed, it was decided not to pursue the development of baricitinib. So it really caught my eye, this particular abstract. Why would someone look at baricitinib, especially in lupus nephritis, when it didn't, succeed in SLE? But anyway, it was a small study. It was investigator-initiated. The study size was 60 patients, comparing 4 milligrams of baricitinib to intravenous cyclophosphamide, 0.7 grams per meter squared, in patients with lupus nephritis. And the authors reported a 75, yes, that's what I said, 75% response rate in the Bari group, and a 50% response rate in the cyclophosphamide group, using conventional proteinuric endpoints. So all I can say is this study needs to be repeated before I sign on. A 75% response rate in a lupus nephritis trial is really hard to swallow. So for that reason, it caught my eye, but I'm not rushing out to give baricitinib to my patients with lupus nephritis.
The future of SLE treatments and trials. Also, several robust treatment pipeline in SLE was presented in congresses and abstracts in 2023, and some others also with efforts and task forces to define new endpoints for SLE clinical trials. Richard, we have discussed some of these points of views on a few podcasts ago, and summing up everything that 2023 gave us on data and research data and news, what do you think are the investigational agents that stand out more, that are more promising, and we will look to them in the future more than others?
Well, there are a lot of promising approaches, and perhaps the best way for me to convey my thoughts is to divide the drugs based upon their mechanisms of action. And I also would pick ones that are in the latter stages of development. So starting with targeting type 1 interferons, I think litifilimab, which has advanced to phase 3, holds promise. It's an antibody directed against a protein called BDCA2, and this protein is uniquely expressed on plasmacytoid dendritic cells. And when it's ligated, production of type 1 interferons, as well as other cytokines and chemokines, is inhibited. So I think that holds promise in phase 3. Targeting the JAK-STAT pathway, as we just talked about, certainly holds promise. Deucravacitinib and UPA, as you said, the pronunciations are going to get more and more difficult over time. But anyway, deucravacitinib and upadacitinib had really nice phase 2 data. We'll see what phase 3 brings. And then moving on to B cells and their growth factors. We talked about telitacicept, some remarkable data in China. We'll see how it performs ex-China. And then I'm kind of hot on obinutuzumab and also ianalumab. These are potent B-cell depleting antibodies. Obinutuzumab targets CD20, whereas ianalumab targets the BAFF receptor. And both are being studied in SLE as well as lupus nephritis. In fact, we might see phase 3 obinutuzumab lupus nephritis data pretty soon, maybe within a year. And again, it's hard not to mention cell therapy. It's in its infancy. I don't know how many lupus patients have been treated, maybe about 40 or 50 worldwide. But the outcomes so far that have been presented have been pretty incredible. So at least here in the United States, there's a cell therapy company popping up every week. And there's got to be about 30 trials or 30 companies looking at autoimmune diseases.
Zahir, what is your pipeline drug of choice right now? I
agree with Richard that the ianalumab is quite promising, although the first study was quite short. And I think, as Richard said, that we need to speak about CAR T cells in SLE. So the first results are very, very impressive. All the patients treated improved dramatically, even though they had a refractory renal disease. Tolerance was satisfactory, and all the lupus treatments could be stopped without relapse after 2 years of follow-up. And what is very impressive is that this is the first time that we are approaching cure, healing in SLE, that is control of the disease without treatment and without relapse. So it's very promising, and hopefully we are involved in the CAR T cell program with Novartis, and we have included 2 patients now, and we are waiting for the results.
An additional question for both of you. We do think obinutuzumab is going to work, and it is being studied for lupus nephritis. Do you think that in the future we'll be using it only for lupus nephritis or also for other involvement, refractory lupus, since all of us, we do have large and long experience with rituximab? What do you think about it?
Well, my feeling is if you're thinking about giving rituximab to a patient, either with lupus nephritis or SLE, then think about obinutuzumab. And in fact, there is a study ongoing in phase 3 called Allegory with obinutuzumab in SLE. So you just have to wait for those data.
Yes, and we are just waiting for the results of the Regency study, obinutuzumab in lupus nephritis, but the findings are promising. And I think that in the future, we will use obinutuzumab rather than rituximab.
And finally, one of the other things that was presented and discussed on the Congress was a task for treatment response measures for SLE, which is undertaking the challenge of modernizing the primary endpoints, as you said before, SRI-4 or BICLA, what are the most important. Not all the trials have good responses on patient-reported outcomes. And the Delphi study identified multiple candidate domains for these novel outcomes measures, and it showed the discrepancies between what were the clinicians and the patients' viewpoints. Richard, do you think that these testing novel agents in the future, we will have more patients' outcomes that will add more to the results? So what do you think that adding more patients' outcome measures and using them with the novel clinicians and diseases measures will change anything in the novel trials?
Yeah, I mean, time will tell. No, I can't say that people are particularly happy with SLEDAI, SRI, BILAG, BICLA, but it's kind of the best we have. And we have certainly seen successes with those outcome measures. But the TRM SLE is led by Eric Morand, and he has an incredibly efficient and productive team from Monash in Australia. And it is an incredibly ambitious project. So there are probably close to 100 experts involved, and these are leaders from academia as well as industry. And there are a lot of patients that are involved in the creation of this outcome measure. So the hope is that it will improve upon our current outcome measures, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and then it obviously needs to be tested. So you just have to stay tuned. I don't know when it's projected that this project will end, maybe in about 2 years or so.
We'll see. Zahir, do you have any other highlight from 2023 that you would like to share?
No, I just like to insist on CAR T cells in autoimmune diseases. Yeah, I think this could be the future. The main problem for our patients is the availability of CAR T cells when the disease is flaring or is refractory. But again, this is the first time that we are discussing on healing of lupus. So I think this is very, very, very interesting.
That there's one thing I would like to highlight from 2023, but not only, is that we are discussing more and more available trials and more drugs that are being developed each year. And it looks good for, if they are approved in the future, if they show differences, it looks good compared to several years ago. So it's an highlight for 2023, as it was an highlight for 2022. And each year there are more drugs that are almost there to make the difference, and we have so much more choices. Richard, do you want to highlight anything more from 2023?
No, I was just going to agree with you. I was one of the first lupus clinical trialists, and that goes back not that long ago, maybe not even 30 years. And at that time, we studied 2 drugs. And now there's just unprecedented clinical trial activity. And there's no question that more drugs will be approved. And what this translates into is better outcomes for our patients.
Perfect. Zahir, Richard, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights from 2023. To our listeners, we hope these discussions have helped you gain more of an understanding of lupus and developments through 2023 and into 2024. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please leave us a review, which will really help us in reaching as many of your colleagues as possible around the world. Join us again next month for more discussion key issues in the management of lupus.